Iranian strategic planners have spent the better part of a decade studying something most Western analysts overlooked entirely. Not Israeli military capabilities, as those have been mapped exhaustively. Instead, Tehran focused on Israeli diplomatic objectives, specifically Israel's careful campaign to deepen NATO involvement in Middle Eastern security architecture. And in that analysis, Iranian intelligence identified something NATO's own strategists have consistently failed to recognize: a structural vulnerability embedded within the alliance's decision-making processes. This isn't conventional military deterrence. Iran has developed a strategy that weaponizes Israeli plans for greater NATO commitment, turning them into a trigger mechanism that exposes fundamental contradictions within the alliance itself. When Israel conducts operations designed to invoke Western solidarity and collective response, Iran responds with surgical precision, forcing NATO into an impossible choice. Respond collectively, and the alliance validates exactly the commitment expansion Tehran wants to discredit. Refuse, and NATO demonstrates the internal divisions Iran seeks to amplify. Either outcome advances Iranian strategic objectives. The sophistication required is remarkable. This strategy demanded deep institutional understanding, NATO consensus procedures, transatlantic threat perception gaps, and the specific mechanisms through which temporary consultations become permanent commitments. The pattern became visible over recent months. Israeli strikes against Iranian-linked positions in Syria and Iraq were accompanied by carefully crafted diplomatic messaging, framing these operations not merely as Israeli security concerns, but as responses to threats against international shipping, energy security, and the broader stability that European economies depend upon. Israeli officials made explicit appeals to NATO capitals, emphasizing shared democratic values and characterizing Iranian activities as challenges to the collective West. Iran's response was telling, not in its intensity, but in its calibration. Tehran avoided maximum escalation that might genuinely unify the alliance through existential threat. Instead, Iranian operations were precisely measured to create internal NATO debates. Responses that targeted maritime corridors in ways that affected Mediterranean members differently than Atlantic ones. Operations were timed to coincide with NATO strategic reviews, forcing the issue onto alliance agendas. Before consensus existed, Iranian public statements explicitly highlighted contradictions between American and European threat assessments. The result wasn't unified NATO action, it was fractured internal debate, with member states articulating incompatible positions, exactly what Tehran's strategy anticipated. The foundation of this Iranian strategy was laid during the most formative period in the Islamic Republic's military history. The 1980-88 war with Iraq. Western powers, particularly the United States and European NATO members, provided Saddam Hussein with intelligence financing and diplomatic cover. Iranian forces faces an adversary backed by the world's most powerful alliance structure. The lesson was definitive. Confronting Western alliances through conventional military means was strategically futile, but understanding their internal contradictions that might be different. In the decade following the war, Iranian intelligence institutions began a systematic study of NATO. They focused particularly on the alliance's expansion debates throughout the 1990s, recognizing how enlargement created inherent tensions between original members and new entrants, with fundamentally different threat perceptions and strategic priorities. Iranian analysts meticulously observed NATO operations in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Libya. Each intervention revealed distinct vulnerabilities, mission creep that exceeded initial mandates, divergent preferences on exit strategies, persistent burden sharing disputes, and consistent gaps between political authorization and actual operational commitment. By 2011, Iranian strategic research centers, particularly those affiliated with IRGC intelligence, had identified a critical shift. Israeli diplomatic strategy was increasingly focused on deepening NATO institutional involvement in Middle Eastern security architecture. This presented a unique opportunity. If Tehran could decode Israeli objectives for NATO activation, Iran could craft responses that triggered alliance mechanisms, while simultaneously exposing the contradictions those mechanisms couldn't resolve. NATO's fatal blind spot stems from a deeply embedded institutional assumption that alliance activation inherently demonstrates success. The consultations signal solidarity. Collective responses prove deterrence, credibility. Invoking alliance mechanisms validates NATO's continued relevance. This cultural foundation creates a fundamental inability to recognize scenarios where activation itself serves adversarial interests rather than a collective defense. The alliance is structurally biased toward interpreting threats as requiring collective response. But this leaves it blind to situations where that response generates more strategic problems than it solves. And the exploitation mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. NATO decision-making requires consensus among members with increasingly divergent national interests. When Iran triggers alliance discussions through precisely calibrated provocations, it forces members to publicly articulate those differences. Eastern European members prioritizing territorial defense against Russia must explain resource commitments to Middle Eastern contingencies. Mediterranean members economically dependent on stable energy imports must justify actions that risk supply disruption. Northern European members with minimal Middle Eastern exposure must defend solidarity expenditures their public's question. This public articulation of divergent priorities weakens alliance cohesion even when consensus is eventually achieved, because it demonstrates that NATO solidarity is negotiated and conditional rather than automatic and assured. Iran has identified the critical vulnerability. NATO's institutional culture treats every call for solidarity as a commitment test the alliance must pass to maintain credibility. But Tehran creates scenarios where both activation and refusal represent strategic failure. The implications extend far beyond immediate Middle Eastern dynamics. Every future crisis involving any NATO member's interests now carries inherent exploitation risk. Iran has provided adversaries worldwide with a proven template for triggering alliance mechanisms in ways that expose contradictions rather than resolve threats. The credibility dimension is particularly profound. NATO's Article 5 collective defense guarantee. The cornerstone of European security architecture depends entirely on certainty of response. Iran has demonstrated that alliance response predictably divides when threats don't affect all members equally. This raises existential questions for Eastern European members if NATO fractures over Middle Eastern contingencies. What prevents similar division over Baltic scenarios that don't directly threaten Atlantic or Mediterranean members? Beyond credibility lies resource allocation. Every activation for non-Article 5 contingencies forces internal debates that consume political bandwidth and distract from core territorial defense preparation. Iran's strategy effectively taxes NATO's decision-making capacity. The demonstration effect matters enormously. China is observing closely whether alliance mechanisms can be systematically manipulated through calibrated provocations with direct implications for US treaty alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Russia benefits from any demonstrated NATO vulnerability to division when member interests diverge. Most critically, this strategy forces the long-standing transatlantic rift, American Indo-Pacific prioritization versus European focus on Russian threats into unavoidable public debate, weakening the political foundation underlying institutional solidarity. Three distinct trajectories now appear possible. The first involves institutional recognition, NATO leadership explicitly acknowledging this vulnerability and developing analytical frameworks capable of distinguishing genuine collective threats from strategically manipulated activations. This would require creating evaluation mechanisms to assess whether proposed responses serve adversarial interests and accepting the uncomfortable reality that not all calls for solidarity merit positive response. The probability remains low. It demands publicly admitting the alliance can be systematically manipulated. The second trajectory involves a continued exploitation. Iran and other adversaries trigger repeated crises that expose internal contradictions without generating sufficient pressure for fundamental reform. NATO becomes progressively less effective as individual members develop informal mechanisms to avoid costly activations. This represents gradual institutional decay rather than dramatic collapse. The alliance continues existing, but with steadily declining operational credibility. The third scenario involves catastrophic activation, a major crisis where NATO is manipulated into genuinely disastrous response, perhaps draining resources during a simultaneous Article 5 emergency, or producing such visibly divided response that alliance ineffectiveness becomes undeniable internationally. Only trauma of this magnitude might force institutional recognition and reform. Iran has identified a genuine structural vulnerability. NATO's institutional inability to recognize when alliance activation serves adversarial strategic interests more than collective defense. Whether this blind spot proves truly fatal depends on whether it can be addressed through institutional learning or whether it's inherent to consensus-based structures operating across fundamentally divergent national interests. The evidence points toward the latter. NATO's entire political culture is constructed on the premise that solidarity demonstrates strength. This makes the alliance institutionally incapable of acknowledging scenarios where solidarity creates strategic weakness. The sophistication of Iranian strategy is remarkable. By using Israeli diplomatic plans as triggering mechanisms, Tehran has created situations from which the alliance cannot easily extract itself. This represents asymmetric warfare at its most refined, conventionally weaker power, using superior strategic understanding to neutralize overwhelming material disadvantages. The broader significance extends well beyond Middle Eastern contingencies. This reveals fundamental challenges facing all alliance structures navigating complex multi-theater, strategic competition. When adversaries understand the internal alliance divergences better than the alliances understand themselves, traditional institutional strengths transform into exploitable vulnerabilities. The truly fatal aspect may not be that this blind spot exists, but that NATO's organizational culture systematically prevents recognition and adaptation.